Hi, everybody. Welcome back. This episode will focus on Australia, the entire country, with quite a bit of history and obviously quite a bit to learn when it comes to the wine growing regions, the wine styles, and methodology. So let's jump right into it with a little bit of history. In 1788, you get Captain Arthur Phillip and the first fleet landed close to Sydney in New South Wales with vine cuttings from the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. The vine spread throughout Southeast Australia and made it all the way to Victoria in 1838. In 1830, the first vineyard was planted in the Swan River Colony by settlers in Western Australia. Some of the most famous companies were established in the 19th century here. Lindemans in 1843, Penfolds in 1844, Orlando Wines in 1847, and Yalumba in 1849. Victoria became the largest producer of wine, thanks in part to the gold rush. Phylloxera hit Victoria in the late 19th century and devastated the industry. It was contained to Victoria and a small area there close to Sydney, though. 1901, the Australian colonies of South Australia, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, Western Australia, and Tasmania are federated as an independent commonwealth. This allows South Australia to become more competitive and becomes the top wine-producing state. Post-phylloxera production is focused on sweet, fortified wines until the 1960s. Still table wine came back into fashion in the 70s, leading to two major styles: very value-oriented soft, fruity wines and iconic fine wines. The 90s and 2000s saw the market flooded with the Australian wines. This is the critter wines, if you will. The 2008 United States and UK recessions, coupled with strengthening Aussie dollar, lowered interest in all categories of Australian wine, which gave us a refocus on quality, terroir, and more restrained styles. The continent is very affected by El Nino and La Nina years. Basically, there are warm waters east of Australia, are cooler during El Nino, and the rain moves away from the coast. And then during La Nina, they move further inland and feature heavy rains. Drought characterized the 2000s, especially 03, 6, 7, 8, and 9, although Western Australia was positively affected. And then La Nina brought wetter weather in 2010. In 2009, there were rampant bushfires, thanks to eucalyptus trees that raged throughout Victoria, killing 173 people and destroying vineyards, including 5% of Yarra Valley. Grapes and styles that you see here, obviously Shiraz is sort of king, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, Merlot, and Semillon are the most planted. There are many alternative varieties, including Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc, Rhone varieties, Italian varieties. You'll see as we get into some of the regions later on, Spanish varieties, Chambourcin, Muscadel, Muscat. You see today they're moving away from more of the concentrated high alcohol, heavily oaked styles into more geographically driven, cooler climate, elegant styles. Wine law for Australia. Wine Australia established the Label Integrity Program in 1990. This means that wines labeled by variety, vintage, or region must contain a minimum 85% of the stated grape vintage or region. If multiple varieties are listed in a blend, they must be listed in order of proportion. And all components making up a minimum of 85% must appear on the label. No listed grape may be in lower proportion than an unlisted variety. In 1993, Australia agrees to prohibit the use of European geographical names, Chianti and Madeira. In 2008, they further the agreements to prohibit use of Burgundy, Champagne, Sherry, Port, Hermitage, Claret, and Amontillado. Tokay was agreed to be phased out by 2020 this year, at which point it will be known as Topic, and Sherry will be further known as Apera. 1994, you get the Wine and Brand Corporation Act of 1980 amended to define geographical indications, or GIs. These are states, zones, regions, and subregions. Regions and subregions have to be single tracts of land comprised of at least 5 independently owned vineyards of at least 5 hectares apiece with a minimum output of 500 tons of wine grapes. In 1996, in order to adhere to the EU requirement of varietally labeled wines to bear a specific region on the label, the multi-state zone of southeastern Australia is created to allow blending. And really, between states and zones, you might want to put in super zones. I'll show you that on the next chart here. I wanted to give you some comparison. So you see within Chile, we have to know that the largest growing area is the viticultural region, followed by a subregion, a zone, and an area. In South Africa, it's geographical units, followed by regions. There's now, as of 2020, a subregion, districts, and wards. And in Australia, it starts with states, followed by the superzone, which is multi-state, zones, regions, and subregions. As far as viticulture and vinification is concerned, here in Australia, the vineyard is highly mechanized. It's lacking population and cheap labor, basically. Everything from harvest to hedging, thinning, pruning, it's all as mechanized as they can get. Vineyards are intentionally planted on flat sites so that they can utilize machines as much as possible. And then in the trend in the 1980s, it was just not even pruned at all. Irrigation, of course, is massively important. There's a lack of water. That's a constant problem, as well as salinity in the soil. Your lakes and your rivers become incredibly important, and drip irrigation is really important. There are two styles here that have been important for Australian viticulture: the regulated deficit irrigation, otherwise known as RDI. This creates water stress during key periods of development. Now, it can lower your yield and damage your aromatics by inhibiting monoterpenes. And then there's the partial root zone drying, or PRD. This reduces your total water usage by up to 50% by alternating drip irrigation from one side of a row to another. And it doesn't really affect the yield. Winery hygiene in Australia is critical. Sanitation for sure. You see sterile filtration. There's judicious use of sulfur dioxide historically. Chaptalization, of course, is illegal here. I mean, I don't understand why you would need to utilize it. It gets pretty ripe. Acidification, though, is fairly common. They're also known for developing bag-in-a-box in the 1960s, and they were early proponents of screw cap closures. Here's a map of Australia, and you can see the entire continent here. And then, of course, we're going to take pay particular attention to Western Australia, the regions here, South Australia too, and then Tasmania here at the end. But we'll start in Western Australia. You can see here the zones of central Western Australia, Eastern Plains, inland and north of Western Australia. We don't see a lot with these two zones. The quality-focused zones are Greater Perth and Southwest Australia, for sure. And you can see within them they have their own sets of regions and subregions. So we'll take a look real quick. Greater Perth is broken down into Swan District, Perth Hills, and Peel. We'll start there, and then we'll take a look at Southwest Australia, And it should be noted that Swan District also has a subregion within it called Swan Valley. Production began in the Greater Perth zone in Swan Valley in the 19th century, but it shifted to Southwestern Australia, where the climates are a bit cooler. So the most important region within Southwest Australia zone is Margaret River Region. It's a coastal region surrounded by Geograph Bay and the Indian and Southern Oceans. In 1965, Dr. John Gladstone was an agronomist that pushed for expansion here. So you get the Gladstone lines. It's a line of longitude that establishes the eastern border of the appellation. In 71, Vass Felix produced the first commercial wine recently. 1999, you see 6 unofficial subzones proposed: Yallingup, Willowbrook, Wallcliffe, Carradale, Carbonup, and Treaton. Willowbrook is probably the most important of that group, and you'll see why here momentarily. The climate of the area is Mediterranean. It's marginally warmer than, say, the Medoc, which would be maritime. You get varying soils with red, gravelly loam as the most prize. It's important to note the first 5 producers here. We mentioned Vass Felix. You also have Cullen, Mosswood, which all 3 of these are Willowbrook, making it perhaps the most important. And then you have Lewin Estate and Cape Mintel, which are both Wallcliffe. Important grape varieties here. You see Chardonnay, which is the Mendoza clone, locally known as Gingin. Cabernet Sauvignon, Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon blends, and Malbec. Great producers here: Vass Felix, we mentioned. They're Hatesbury Chardonnay and the Tom Colletti Cabernet Sauvignon. Lewin Estates Art Series, and then Cullen with Vanya and Diana Madalena Cabernet Sauvignons and the Kevin John Chardonnay. Staying in Southwest Australia, we moved to the Great Southern Region, very isolated here. We saw Riesling stakes in 1965 at Mount Barker. So there's 5 official subregions here: Mount Barker, Franklin River, Purungaroop, Denmark, and Albany. Some of the coolest, wettest terrain in Australia. Albany and Denmark are the coolest, producing Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Purungaroop and Mount Barker are inland and more continental. You find granite in Purungaroop. There's also Riesling and Shiraz here. Of course, Forest Hill Vineyard in Mount Barker was planted in '66. And Franklin River boomed in the 1990s. This is where Franklin Estate, for their Riesling and Bordeaux blend, almost reward. We'll take again another look here at Western Australia. You can see Great Southern here, Margaret River here, and then Swan District, Perth Hills, Peel. And then we're going to move forward to South Australia. And in fact, before we do that, I want to just point out the states here in South Australia. You got South Australia, you've got Victoria, and New South Wales. Cool. Remains completely phylloxera-free. Really depends on irrigation from the Murray River in South Australia, about half of the national total production. You also have the Adelaide Super Zone here, right? So this is Barossa, Fleurieu, and Mount Lofty ranges, and encompasses the most important premium GIs and allows for blending across it. In the Barossa Zone, you have Orlando Wines, the first commercial winery in 1847. There's over 100 hectares of wines over 100 years old. The world's oldest Shiraz wines are owned by Langmill. Freedom in 1843 is when it was planted. You find the world's oldest Mataro, otherwise known as Mourvedre, with Hewitson's Old Garden, established in 1853 or planted in 1853. You find Australia's oldest Cabernet, with Penfolds Block 42, planted in 1888 in Kalimna in the northern Barossa. You also have what's known as the Barossa Old Vine Charter, which sets aside vines and their ages. For old vines, they have to be a minimum of 35 years old. Survivor would be 70 years, Centenarian 100, and Ancestor 125 years. This was initially developed by Yalumba. The Barossa Valley region within the Barossa Zone is perhaps Australia's largest fine wine district. You get warmer, lower elevation between 100 and 300 meters. Your soil types here, deep, loamy clay with plentiful underground water. There's also some big business here. There's Treasury, there's Wolf Blass, Pernod Ricard, and Yalumba, which is still family owned, surprisingly. Of course, grapes, Shiraz, we have to mention. You also have Cabernet Sauvignon, Mataro, Grenache, Semillon, and Muscat. Here is a culture of grape growers, not tended by winemakers, thanks to the age of the vineyards. Penfolds, of course, established in 1844, famous for the Penfolds Grange, first produced in 51, with 52 being the first commercial vintage by Max Schubert. It's also known as Bin 95. Mostly Shiraz with a touch of Cabernet Sauvignon. This encapsulates the multi-vineyard, multi-region blending tradition. Typically retails around $700, sometimes even more. You also have Torbreck, established 150 years after Penfolds. Great wines in their portfolio include the Runrig Shiraz Viognier with about 50% new French oak, and the Laird, which is their 100% Shiraz from single vineyard old vine Shiraz, 100% new oak, and a very high retail number. In addition to those two, you find Seppelsfeld, which is known for a long history of fortified wines. Their 100-year-old Par La Cour, which is vintage specific, not quite tawny, not quite Madeira. The Solera began in 1878. It's been topped up every year since then. And it's not bottled until it's 100 years old, which means that the current release on it is 1920. These are released as 100 milliliter bottles with a super high price. They're produced from Shiraz, Mataro, Grenache, and Cabernet Sauvignon. And in fact, this was, I think his name is Benno Seppelt, was the one that started it in 1878. And you saw generations of winemakers afterwards continue to produce and keep up the Solera until they started releasing it. I think the first release is like 1912 or something like that. Other styles include sparkling Shiraz, typically at least semi-sweet. You see GSM blends, and then you see Semillon. Other great producers of the Barossa Valley region, Peter Lehmann, Two Hands, Wolf Blass. Within the Barossa zone, you also have the Eden Valley, This is higher elevation, up to about 600 meters and cooler climate. Here in 1847, Joseph Gilbert planted Pusey Vale Vineyard and Barossa Ranges. Soils are more red clay with granite outcroppings. You have a lot of German heritage, brought with it fondness for Riesling, of course. Colin Gramp planted a schistous hilltop with Riesling in 1971 and called it Steingarten. Shiraz is the other grape of importance, and here in the Eden Valley, the most important producer is Henschke. Their Hill Grey Shiraz, which was planted in 1860, was first produced in 1958. Sort of the counterpoint to the multi-region, multi-state blend of Grange as a single vineyard wine here. You also have Mount Edelstone in their portfolio for 100-year-old Shiraz wines. That might be Cabernet. I can't remember. Henschke also produces a really great Cabernet. We might need to look at that. In addition, in Eden Valley, you have Chris Ringland, who is a winemaker at Granite Creek. He produces Estate, Three Rivers, and Randall's Hill Shiraz. Tons of new oak, plenty of alcohol, very low supply, and very astronomical prices. When I say there's plenty of alcohol, I've seen these in like the 17% range. You should also know Pusey Vale, the Contours Riesling, and of course Yalumba, the oldest family-owned winery, founded by Samuel Smith in 1849. They also produce Octavius, first vintage in 1990. These are old vine Shiraz and 100-liter hogshead produced on their own on-site cooperage, where they use a blend of French, Hungarian, and American oak. And then Torrey Matthews, known for being a great value producer. Here you can see South Australia again. For some reason, we have these, this picture over here. Yeah, this is great. You could see the Barossa Valley and Eden Valley here within the Barossa zone. Perfect. And then Mount Lofty Ranges region, I should actually probably show that to you here, is Adelaide Plains, Adelaide Hills, and Clare Valley. A little strange that it stretches all the way up there. Adelaide Hills, too, has subregions of Lindswood and Piccadilly, and we'll show you a little bit more about each of those, too. So we start with Clare Valley in the north. This is a series of narrow north-south valleys on an elevated plateau with varying soil types, very much a cooler climate, with about 400 to 600 meters in elevation. In 1851, the Jesuits built Seven Hill Cellars, which still makes sacramental wine today. Grapes here in Clare Valley, Shiraz is the most planted, but you also have to be aware of Riesling, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Malbec. Soil here is limestone-based Terra Rossa with some slate. It's affected by the Spencer Gulf and the Gulf St. Vincent with breezes. Great producers, Grosset for their Polish Hill Riesling and their Gaia Bordeaux blend. Killicanoon, who produced the Oracle Shiraz, first vintage of 1997, very minimal intervention. Jim Barry, established in 1959. His Armagh Shiraz was first planted in 1968. He also produces some great Rieslings. Petaluma, and then Wendouree. Wendouree was established in 1892. They produce about 2,000 cases on 30 acres. This is the epitome of colt, you can't find it, wines when it comes to South Australia. Adelaide Hills region, this sits in the ridges of the South Mount Lofty Ranges. Soils here, more gray, loamy sands. This is South Australia's wettest region with cool climate and focus on white grapes, for sure. 70% of it is white. The Piccadilly sub-region focuses on Chardonnay, where Petaluma planted the first commercial vineyards in 1976, and then the Lindswood sub-region focuses more on Sauvignon Blanc. Here you'll find Pinot Noir and lighter Shiraz as the red grape focus. You also find Pinot Gris, Viognier, and Riesling as alternative white varieties. There's a fair amount of sparkling wine. Largest producers here, Petaluma and Sean Smith. You also find the Lane, Golding, Lucy Margot, Bird in Hand, and BK Wines. This is more a region for up-and-coming experimental hipster style wines, I would say. The Adelaide Plains region is the warmest region in the Adelaide super zone and nearly the driest. It's home of Penfield's McGill Estate, where the first experiments with Grange were conducted. It's not necessarily known for quality wine production today, though. Again, we'll take a back out. We've looked at Mount Lofty Ranges and Barossa, and next I think we're going to look at Fleurieu, which includes McLaren Vale here, Langhorne Creek, Currency Creek, Southern Fleurieu, and Kangaroo Island. I can actually zoom in on that a little bit for you. Yeah, right through here. And you can see the Gulf St. Vincent and the Spencer Gulf here. and how both of those would play into the Clare Valley and the Southern Ocean, of course. It's important to note Lake Alexandrina too, right next to Langhorne Creek and Currency Creek. Cool. Fleurieu zone. The McLaren Vale is perhaps the most important. The major geographical features here, the mountain lofty ranges are to the east and the Gulf of St. Vincent to the west. This butts up against the southwest corner of Adelaide Hills. First vines were planted in South Australia, here by John Raynell. There's a concentration of very old vines. The climate here is windy and warm. There's no phylloxera and not much fungal disease threat. So you see a lot more organic and biodynamic viticulture. Drought is the main viticultural hazard. You see use of recycled wastewater from Adelaide suburbs. Grapes, predominantly red. Shiraz, Cab, Grenache, Sangio, Nebbiolo, Primitivo, Saperavi, Sagrantino, some pretty cool grapes going in here. For whites, you find Chardonnay, Roussanne, Fiano, Vermentino, and Viognier. The soils here in McLaren Vale are exceedingly different across it. There's a whole bunch of them. They're known as terraneous, which are areas in which one rock or group of rocks are prevalent. There are 7 laid out. The ancient rocks, which is ancient bedrock, sanded sandstone, limestone country, I think it's limestone county actually, clay plains of Aldinga, the Piedmont, which is alluvial, the alluvial plains, the talus slope, which is variable near the Wollonga fault, and then the alluvial flats. So basically, super varied, right? Super varied soils, super varied climates all throughout the region. The growing season lengthens as you move more inland and upward in altitude away from the coast. McLaren Vale also has the Scarce Earth Project, and this emphasizes single-site Shiraz. It started in 2011 for the 2009 vintage onward. These are 100% single block Shiraz, all from McLaren Vale, and 95% from a nominated block. The vines have to be 10 years old. They have to be not excessively shaded by oak, no faults, no over or under ripeness, essentially. Great producers in McLaren Vale include Darrenberg, Yankara, Chapel Hill, Wira, Paxton, Jalma, and Cascabel. The Langhorne Creek region is not nearly as well known as McLaren Vale, but is producing wines of similar quality. Big houses use wines to blend here. This is Wolf Blass, Orlando Wines, who has Jacobs Creek Treasury. They also use irrigation water from that Lake Alexandrina that I was pointing out earlier. And there's not a ton of information on Currency Creek, Kangaroo Island at this point. I should probably add those in here. Lower Murray Zone is where Riverland is, and it's that giant area. We'll take a look at the map here in just a second. This is Australia's leader in production, a quarter of the annual grape tonnage. It follows the Murray River from the eastern border of South Australia all the way to Eden Valley. It's hot, it's arid, there are fertile soils. This is large value brands, Berry, Oxford Landing, and Van Rock Station. And you can see the Riverland area right here. Cool. So we've covered the Barossa zone, the Fleurieu zone, the Mount Lofty Ranges. We're not really going to talk much about far north. We're going to get into Limestone Coast next, which is down here. And it's really separated out into the True Coast, Robe and Mount Benson, where there's not a whole lot going on. And then further inland, Pathaway, Rattenbully, the most important, Coonawarra, and Mount Gambier. And here we have the Limestone Coast. Of course, Coonawarra region, 1891, John Riddick plants grapevines at Penola Fruit Colony, which was later renamed Coonawarra in 1897. From 49 to 56, Cabernet starts to take hold with Chateau Comalm Treasure Chest Clarets, and 56, Lindemann purchases the Chateau Treasure Chest label. In 1951, Samuel and David Wynn purchased Chateau Comalm and Riddick's property from Woodley's and began producing a state-bottled, varietally labeled Cabernet Sauvignon. Today, that John Riddick by Wynn's Cabernet is a top bottling. The soil here is 9 miles by 1 mile of terra rossa, which is friable clay loam with iron oxide over fissured limestone, allowing for both water drainage and retention. So you see terra rossa crop up in a few places. We mentioned it earlier with Clare Valley. We'll mention it again in Rattenbully. There's some other places throughout the globe where it exists too, but it's beautiful red soil, red limestone soil essentially. The climate here is cool Mediterranean. It's far enough away from the coast to where it doesn't have as much of a maritime influence, so it's relatively dry. And you can start to see some frost issues here in the winter and spring. Now, the boundaries of Coonawarra were hotly contested thanks to the soil profile, which wanted it to be smaller, versus the climate and water, which wanted it to be larger. And the GI wasn't formally established until 2003, actually. Styles mirror much of what's happening in the rest of Australia. You're seeing a pullback on oak usage, quality improvement in the vineyards. There's a rise in cheap labor coming from Asia. There's single vineyard expressions, much more medium body and moderate alcohol content. Your Cabernet here tends to exhibit red fruits with that secondary herbaceous and eucalyptus character, probably due to the gum trees, because monoterpene eucalyptol can be transferred through the air. And treasury here is big. You find Wins, Penfolds, Lindeman, and Jameson Run. Other regions within the Limestone Coast zone, Padthaway is heavily cultivated, slightly warmer than Coonawarra for Cab, Shiraz, and Chardonnay. Big houses here, Seppelt, Lindemans, Hardy's, Wins, and Orlando wines. Rattenbully, which we mentioned, also has Terra Rossa, very red wine focused with a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon. Mount Gambier in the south surrounds mountain and town of the same name. Much cooler climate, so you see more Pinot Noir and Sauvignon Blanc. And then Robe and Mount Benson, we mentioned, no viticulture prior to 1989. It's less than 1,000 hectare, but it's driven by Shiraz, Cabernet, Sauvignon Blanc, and Chardonnay. Now we're going to move forward to Victoria. I'll take a look here. And you can see in the southern tip of South Australia. This is super blurry, and I apologize. I really like the Wine Australia maps, but they've taken them off of their website, and so it makes it kind of hard to find really great ones. You can also see here in the north and northwest Victoria zone, Murray-Darling and Swan Hill. These are famous for overlapping into New South Wales too, so they share between the two of them. We're going to look specifically at Central Victoria with Bendigo, Goulburn Valley, Heathcote, Strathbogie Ranges, Upper Goulburn, but more importantly, probably Northeast Victoria, where you'll find Rutherglen, and Port Phillip down here, where we'll find Yarra Valley. Those are the most important areas, I would say. So the smallest and coolest state on the mainland is Victoria. The vineyards were first planted here in 1838 in Yarra Valley. The gold rush booms business, phylloxera turns and kills it. So except for Yarra, who didn't see it until 2006. There's wine growing throughout the entire region. There's numerous rivers that make irrigation possible. And then you have the Great Dividing Range and its foothills providing altitude to moderate temperatures further inland. That Port Phillip zone, where Yarra Valley is the most important area of production in all of Victoria. You have complex topography, anywhere from 50 to 470 meters of elevation. You get warm days, cool nights, but relatively high rainfall. The southern end of the valley is especially cool. For soils, you find gray, sandy, and lower Yarra north, or clay loam and red volcanic in upper Yarra south, which is higher elevation. Grape varieties, the reds outnumber the whites, but Chardonnay is the most planted overall variety, followed by Pinot Noir, Cab, and Shiraz. Chardonnay here tends to be mineral driven with no malo and very little new oak. Pinot Noirs here tend to be lean and light. There is sparkling wine. Moet set up their Australian version of Domaine Chandon here. And then great producers, Yarra Yering is probably top of the food chain, but De Bertoli, Yering Station, Luke Lambert, Mac Forbes, and Giant Steps are also here. Up next in the Port Phillip zone, you'll find the Mornington Peninsula region. It's surrounded by water with the Bass Strait, the Port Phillip Bay, and the Western Port Bay. It's breezy and quite cool. There's more estate bottling, and growers and winemakers are one and the same here. Soils here, you find red volcanic of Red Hill. You find sedimentary yellow duplex of Turong, brown duplex of Merricks, and sandy clay loam of Murradug. And duplex is a contrasting texture between soil horizons. Grape varieties here, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Pinot Gris. The MV6 clone of Pinot Noir was thought to be brought by Busby from Clos Vougeot. Great producers, Paringa Estate, Stony A Wines, Main Ridge Estate, Ferrego and Keylong make awesome Chardonnays. You should definitely look into those. And then Ocean 8. Other regions, Keylong is the driest in Port Phillip. It had dealt with phylloxera for over 100 years until 2012 when they were able to declare themselves completely phylloxera free. Very maritime influenced and windy. Great producers are by far Bannockburn and Scotchman's Hill. And then Macedon Range is the coolest region on the mainland, 400 to 600 meters in elevation. Here you'll find Chardonnay and Pinot Noir and really great wines being produced by Bindi. And you can see, we should probably zoom out on this real quick before we get away from it, but here's Melbourne, which I think is extremely important to realize that that's where Yarra Valley is, and then your Mornington Peninsula that sits on all three sides. Sunbury and Keylong too. Cool. In the Northeast Victoria zone, you find Rutherglen. This is hot continental, super hot. The grapes here, brown muscat, which is Muscat de Frontignan or Muscat Rouge à Petit Grand, Derif, Shiraz, Muscadel, Chardonnay, and Marsanne. It's bounded in the north by the Murray River. The soils here are known as Rutherglen loam or Black Dog fine sandy loam. You have a history of sweet, fortified stickies that remain the mainstay of the region. You've got Rutherglen Muscat, where botrytis is not desirable. Pasturage is really the method. Wine is quickly fermented, 1 to 2 days on the skin. Then it's fortified with a neutral 96-degree grape spirit and added in a 1:4 ratio. This matures in various formats of old wood. It typically evaporates at about 5% per year, which concentrates your sugar, acid, and alcohol. Now, some producers use Solera, some blend lots and vintages just before bottling. But within this, you've got the Muscat of Rutherglen Network. Producer syndicate established in 1995. There's a 4-tier classification system, and that includes Rutherglen Muscat, Classic, Grand, and Rare. Your baseline young Muscat has to sit between 180 and 240 grams per liter of residual sugar. At Classic, it retains intense varietal aroma, but adds concentration in a slight amount of Rancio, steps up the residual sugar to 200 to 280. I think your Grand is perhaps the most important. It's more oxidative. It shows a lot more Rancio in style and sits between 270 and 400 grams per liter. And then the most difficult to find would be the Rare, and it should taste as if it's at least 20 years old. It's the sweetest, the most concentrated, and it sits at the same RS level as Grand. These are super cool and super hard to find. And then Topake, which was formerly called Tokai. This is fortified Muscadel, right? So you use Muscat for the Muscat of Rutherglen, and you use Muscadel for Topake. These are production and classifications similar to Muscat. It's a little lighter in color with typically 30 to 40 grams less per liter of residual sugar, and it works great as an aperitif. Great producers in the region: Campbell's, Chambers, All Saints, Morris, Pfeiffer, Stanton, and Colleen. Outside of Rutherglen in the Northeast Victoria zone, you also have Glenrowan, which produces similar styles of fortified wines. And then you have Alpine Valleys, Beechworth, and King Valley regions. These are much cooler and progressively higher in elevation. King Valley actually gets up to 800 meters. Here you find Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Gris, Pinot Noir, and some Bordeaux varieties. King Valley is also known for sparkling wine. Then your Northwest Victoria zone, we mentioned Swan Hill and Murray-Darling being shared with New South Wales. Murray River is obviously quite important here, and you find more value brand wines. In Western Victoria, you find the Grampians region, which is the western end of the Great Dividing Range. You've got cool and arid climates up to 440 meters in elevation. Historical reputation here for sparkling wine. 1890, Charles Pirlo, trained famously at Pommery, made the first traditional sparkling wine in Great Western. You've also got Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Riesling, and Shiraz, and your best producers of the area are Seppelt. The Gippsland zone has no smaller regions, production concentrated in Western Gippsland near Yarra Valley, where you have Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. It's only 240 hectare. I should mention too, in Western Victoria, that you've also got Grampian and Hinties. Maybe I should back that up so you can see it real quick. Yeah, and Pyrenees. Hinty, Grampians, and Pyrenees, all right here. Sort of just highlighting the best regions. Now we get to New South Wales, and this is going to move pretty quickly, right? Let's get right into it. New South Wales was the site of first vineyards in 1791. Busby planted a bunch of European cuttings in 1831 at Kirkton Estate and Sydney Botanical Gardens. The most important zone, Hunter Valley Zone, has the Hunter Region, with subregions of Upper Hunter Valley, Pokelbin, and Broke Fordwich. This is a subtropical, warmest and wettest climate in the area. It's bounded in the north by the Murray River. The soils here in the Upper Hunter are black silt and dark clay loam, and the Lower Hunter, it's friable loam with friable red duplex. Wyndham is your oldest continually operating winery since 1828, and Hunter has remained entirely phylloxera-free. In the Hunter region, grape varieties include Semillon, known as Hunter Riesling, Chardonnay, Verdelho, Shiraz, and Merlot. And in fact, I think it's either in Pokelbin or Broke Fordwich, but you've got like 100-year-old Verdelho plantings. Semillon is ripe fruit character, develops early in the season here, and you can therefore pick it early with high levels of acid and low levels of alcohol. No oak, no leaf stirring, and it tends to be aged a little bit before being released. Shiraz performs well in the volcanic soils of Lower Hunter. And then a couple of great producers. Terrell's, their Vat 1 Semillon, is aged 5 years before release, and they take credit for the first varietal bottling of Chardonnay in 1971 under their Vat 47 label. And then Broken Wood, their ILR Semillon, is aged 6 years before it's released. And you can see here, that's where Hunter is. Cool. The Central Ranges zone, right next to it, houses the Mudgee, Orange, and Cowra areas. Mudgee known for being next to Hunter, drier and sunnier, slightly higher elevation, actually quite a bit higher elevation. Grapes here are more Cabernet, Merlot, Chardonnay, Shiraz, and Riesling. Chardonnay, though, historically produced by Craigmore and Mudgee Wines, a couple of other great producers, Oatleys and Montrose. Orange, this is the Central Ranges' coolest region. It's the highest region in Australia, beginning at 600 meters up to its highest point at Mount Canobolas, an extinct volcano providing rich basalt soils. Grapes here, Cabernet, Merlot, Chardonnay, Shiraz, and Sauvignon Blanc. Grape producers, Bloodwood, Canobolas Smith, and Word of Mouth. And you can see here that Mudgee, Orange, and Cowra. Cool. The Big River Zone. This is where the Murray and Murrumbidgee rivers are. This is Riverina region. This is the production leader for the entire state. Chardonnay is the most planted, and then you get Shiraz and Semillon. That is really misspelled because there's just an M in there. You get various alluvial soils. Big companies here, De Bertolli, McWilliams, and Casella, which is the largest family-owned. There's also high-end botrytis-affected wines here. McWilliams, but De Bertolli's Noble One Botrytis Semillon, which debuted in 1982. And this is the Riverina region. Cool. And then we finish with southern New South Wales zone with Canberra, Tumbarumba, Gundagai, and Hilltops. Canberra district in 1971, Lake George and Clonakilla planted the grapes here. Soils here are brown clay loam. Grapes are Shiraz, Cabernet, Merlot, Pinot Noir, Riesling, and Gruner. Grape producers are Clonakilla, Larkhill, and Helm. Tumbarumba, this is the foothills of the Snowy Mountains. So you get a cooler climate, you get higher elevation. They produce sparkling wine, and of course, with that, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Gundagai region, still in its infancy, but known for the Murrumbidgee River. And then Hilltops region, this is 80% red grapes. Clonakilla has been sourcing here for over a decade. That is continental Australia. Now we're going to shift to the island just off the coast in Tasmania. This is probably the best map that I've found. Unofficial subregions that you need to know about: Pipers River, Tamar Valley, Derwent Valley, Huon Valley, Northeast and Northwest. But you can see really everything's on the eastern side of things. And then Hobart would be the biggest city in Tasmania, and important to note too. Cool continental climate: Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Riesling, Pinot Gris. You've also got Bass Strait and the Tasman Sea to help moderate temperature, and long sunshine hours promote long, steady growing season. We mentioned the rivers: Pipers River, and then of course Derwent. The southeast region is sheltered by Franklin, Princess, and the Gordon Ranges, and of course, great sparkling wine from Tasmania. Producers here include Jantz, Tamar Ridge, Piper's Brook Vineyard, Domain A, Penfolds, Yatarna, Chardonnay. Before we leave Australia, I think it's important to note the Langton's classification of Australian wine. This inaugural classification came online in 1990, and it's based on reputation and track record at auction. It was then re-examined in 96, 2000, 2005, 2010, and 2014. And it's broken down into 3 categories: exceptional, outstanding, and excellent. And I've listed here all of the wines in the most recent exceptional listing, just to show you this is really a who's who, top of the class of Australian wines. Penfolds Grange, Bass Phillip Reserve Pinot, Broken Woods Graveyard Shiraz, Chris Ringland's Barossa Ranges Shiraz, Clarendon Hills Australis, it's misspelled, it should be Astralis, Clonakilla, Shiraz Viognier, the Cullen Diana Madeleine, Cab Merlot, the Gioconda Chardonnay, the Grosset Polish Hill, the Hinchkey Hill of Grace, the Hinchkey Mount Edelstone, the Jim Barry Armagh, Luna Estates Art Series Chardonnay, the Mosswood Cabernet, the Mount Mary Quintet Cabernet Blend, which are fantastic wines, Penfolds Bin 707 Cab, the Rockford Basket Press Shiraz, Torbreck's Runrig, Windery that we talked about, Wynn's John Riddick Cabernet, and Seppeltsfield's Para the Cure 100-year-old Tawny. I think we made mention of just about all these wines throughout the presentation, which is good. You can go back and take a look and see where they all come from. But if you were putting together a hit list of the greatest wines of this continent, I would certainly focus on these. You also have to mention, beyond what's in the Langton's classification of great and exceptional wines, there are some pretty big producers all throughout Australia. I went ahead and listed some of the brands within Treasury. You can see Lindemans, Penfolds, Wynn's, Beringer, Bouleau, so on and so forth. For Pernod Ricard, you find Brancott Estate, Orlando Wines, which is Jacobs Creek, along with several others, and then Casella. And these are the critter wines, Yellowtail, right? Casella, Peter Lehman, Morris, and Young Brood. Appreciate you all tuning in today. We'll be back over the weekend with a new presentation, but I hope you drink some more Australian wine and enjoy it. Cheers.